My mother-in-law gave me disgusting perfume that smelled like rotting flowers for my birthday. I made sure her house reeked of it permanently. My mother-in-law Sophia bought me the most disgusting perfume that smelled like rotting flowers mixed with chemical cleaner for my birthday, and insisted I wear it every time I visited because it was expensive and she'd chosen it specially for me. The perfume was called Evening Meadow, but smelled more like a meadow where something had died and been covered with artificial air freshener to hide the decay. Sophia presented it to me at my birthday dinner in front of everyone, saying she'd noticed I never wore nice fragrances, and this would help me smell more sophisticated instead of like whatever cheap body spray I usually used. She actually sprayed it on me right there at the restaurant, saying I needed to start wearing it immediately to get used to smelling elegant. The entire restaurant section cleared out because the smell was so overwhelming, but Sophia said only people with refined noses could appreciate expensive perfume. She told my husband Robert that I'd probably never experienced quality fragrance before, and my nose would need training to recognize luxury when I smelled it. Every time we visited Sophia's house, she'd inspect me at the door, and if she couldn't smell Evening Meadow, she'd spray me with the bottle she kept by the entrance for this purpose. She'd douse me in it, saying I must have forgotten to apply enough and real ladies never left home without their signature scent. She told everyone in the family that she'd finally given me some class with this perfume, and I was slowly learning to be the kind of wife Robert deserved. When I tried to tell Sophia the perfume gave me headaches and made me nauseous, she said that was just my body adjusting to quality ingredients instead of the synthetic garbage I was accustomed to. She actually said poor people often had physical reactions to expensive things because their bodies weren't calibrated for luxury. She'd reapply it to me throughout visits, saying the scent was fading, and I needed to learn proper reapplication techniques if I wanted to maintain an aura of sophistication. She bought me 6 more bottles for Christmas, saying she'd noticed I wasn't wearing it daily, and obviously needed more supply to make it a habit. Sophia told her book club that she was trying to elevate her daughter-in-law, but some people resisted improvement because they were comfortable with mediocrity. That's when I decided Sophia needed to experience her own gift more intimately. I started bringing the perfume to her house and secretly spraying it everywhere when she wasn't looking. I'd spray her curtains while she was in the kitchen and her throw pillows while she was in the bathroom. I'd douse her coat closet and saturate her bathroom towels with Evening Meadow until her entire house reeked of the nauseating scent. When Sophia complained about a strange smell, I'd innocently suggest she must have spilled her expensive perfume somewhere and offer to help look for the leak. I'd spray more while pretending to search, hitting her mattress, her carpet, and the inside of her car when she gave me her keys to get something. The smell became so embedded in her house that no amount of cleaning could remove it, because I'd been strategic about spraying fabrics that absorbed and held scent. Her living room smelled like a funeral home that had caught fire, and her bedroom was so saturated she had to sleep on the couch. Next, I started spraying Evening Meadow on Sophia's clothes while they hung in her closet during our visits. Every outfit she owned began reeking of the perfume she'd forced on me. When she'd change clothes to escape the smell, the new outfit would smell even worse because I'd double sprayed her favorites. She'd arrive at church or restaurants surrounded by a cloud of Evening Meadow that made people move away from her. Her friends started declining her invitations because being near her meant being assaulted by the overwhelming stench she couldn't identify or escape. I sprayed her yoga mat at the gym and her chair at the hair salon, so everywhere Sophia went, Evening Meadow followed. The real satisfaction came when Sophia hosted her annual charity luncheon, and I arrived early to help set up. I sprayed Evening Meadow on every chair cushion, tablecloth, and napkin in her dining room. I soaked the artificial flower arrangements and doused the powder room hand towels. By the time guests arrived, the house smelled like a chemical spill at a flower factory. The ladies could barely eat because the smell was so nauseating, and several had to leave early claiming sudden illness. Sophia was mortified when one guest asked if something had died in her walls, and another suggested she check for gas leaks. They all fled within an hour, and Sophia's reputation as a hostess was destroyed. She called a professional cleaning service, but they said the smell was too embedded in everything to remove without replacing all soft furnishings. Sophia had to throw away curtains, cushions, and rugs worth thousands of dollars. She had her house professionally fumigated, thinking there was something rotting somewhere, but the fumigators found nothing except the overwhelming presence of Evening Meadow in every fiber of her home. She spent weeks living in a hotel while her house aired out, but the smell had penetrated so deeply that it lingered for months. Then Sophia finally confronted me about possibly spilling perfume in her house. She stood there blocking her own doorway with her arms crossed tight against her chest, and her eyes had that look people get when they're trying to decide if you're lying to them. She asked if I remembered spilling any of the perfume during my visits, because the smell was everywhere now, and she'd already spent thousands of dollars trying to get rid of it. My heart started beating faster, but I kept my face looking worried and innocent, like I was just as confused as she was. I told her I'd been super careful with the perfume she gave me because I knew it was expensive, and I didn't want to waste even a drop of something that cost so much. She stared at my face for a long time like she was searching for proof that I was lying, and I could see how tired and desperate she looked after dealing with this problem for months. I offered to help her search for where the smell might be coming from, playing my part as the concerned daughter-in-law who wanted to solve this mystery. Sophia led me through her house, pointing at all the places where the smell was strongest, and I made sympathetic sounds while secretly remembering exactly when and where I'd sprayed each spot. She showed me the new curtains she'd bought to replace the ones that reeked of evening meadow, and her voice actually cracked when she explained how the smell kept coming back no matter what she did. The new fabric already smelled like rotting flowers mixed with chemicals, and I had to press my lips together to keep from smiling. Sophia's hands were shaking when she told me she'd spent over $15,000 on new furniture, professional cleaners, and the fumigation service that couldn't find anything wrong. She described living in a hotel for 3 weeks waiting for her house to air out, then coming back to find the smell still soaked into everything she owned. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and new lines around her mouth from stress. For just a second, I felt something that might have been guilt starting to grow in my chest, but then I remembered her spraying me at that birthday dinner while everyone watched and telling people I didn't know how to smell sophisticated. Robert showed up without warning and walked into the middle of our conversation, and he immediately noticed something was wrong between his mother and me. Sophia turned to him and explained her theory that I must have accidentally knocked over a perfume bottle somewhere in her house without realizing it. Robert looked uncomfortable having to be part of this situation, and his eyes kept moving back and forth between us like he was hoping someone else would show up and fix the problem for him. I kept acting innocent and suggested that maybe the perfume bottles Sophia kept all over her house had leaked on their own since she owned so many of them. Sophia's eyes got narrow and hard because she knew I was talking about her obsessive collection of Evening Meadow that she'd bought specifically to force on me at every visit. Robert cleared his throat in that awkward way he does and said maybe the perfume just had a really strong smell that stayed in places naturally. Both Sophia and I turned to stare at him because his comment was completely useless and didn't help anything. Sophia waved her hand at Robert like she was brushing away his words and focused back on me, asking if I'd been wearing the perfume to her house like she'd told me to. I said yes, I wore it every single time I visited because she insisted on it. Which true since I'd been carrying bottles in my purse just for revenge purposes. She looked frustrated that my answer didn't give her the proof she wanted that I'd caused all this damage to her house. During the next few days, Sophia called me 3 separate times asking detailed questions about how I applied the perfume and whether I'd noticed any broken bottles anywhere. I answered each phone call with patient concern in my voice while privately enjoying how desperate she sounded trying to solve this mystery. She was clearly thinking about this problem all the time, and I could hear how exhausted she was from months of living with a smell she couldn't escape or explain. Robert called me when Sophia wasn't around and asked carefully if I knew anything about the perfume situation at his mother's house. His voice sounded like he suspected something but didn't want to actually accuse me of anything directly. I told him his mother had been spraying that perfume on me for months, even when I said no, so if her house smelled like it now, maybe she should think about her own behavior causing the problem. My direct answer seemed to surprise Robert because there was a long, quiet pause on the phone before he admitted he never realized how much his mother's perfume gift had bothered me. I reminded him about the birthday dinner where she sprayed me in front of everyone at the restaurant, the inspections at her front door, the time she reapplied it to me during visits, and the 6 extra bottles she gave me for Christmas. He sounded genuinely uncomfortable as he started understanding the pattern of how controlling his mother had been toward me. Robert suggested we should all sit down together and talk about the perfume situation to clear the air between everyone. I agreed because I wanted to see if he would finally stand up to his mother, or just avoid the conflict like he always did. Sophia agreed to the meeting but made it very clear she still thought I was somehow responsible for contaminating her entire house with that awful smell. The restaurant Robert picked was one of those chain places with fake vintage signs on the walls and menus that went on for 20 pages. Sophia was already sitting in a corner booth when I arrived, her arms crossed tight over her chest like she was physically holding herself together. She'd wrapped a navy scarf around her neck even though it was warm inside, and when she shifted in her seat I caught a wave of Evening Meadow so strong it made my eyes water. Robert stood up to hug me, but the gesture felt stiff and rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the car on the way over. Sophia didn't wait for me to sit down before she leaned forward and asked if I was going to admit I spilled perfume all over her house. Her voice was loud enough that the couple at the next table glanced over, and I saw Robert's face flush red as he tried to get his mother to lower her volume. I slid into the booth across from Sophia and looked her directly in the eyes without blinking or looking away. I told her I never spilled anything in her house, which was completely true since every single spray had been on purpose and carefully aimed at specific targets. She stared back at me like she was trying to catch me in a lie, her mouth pressed into a thin line that made wrinkles appear around her lips. I kept my expression calm and concerned, like I was genuinely confused about why she would think I'd been careless with the expensive perfume she'd given me. Robert cleared his throat and suggested maybe we should talk about why this perfume had become such a big problem between all of us. Sophia's eyes snapped toward him like she couldn't believe he wasn't immediately taking her side and demanding I confess. Sophia launched into this whole speech about how she'd only been trying to help me learn about sophistication and quality fragrances. She said she'd noticed I never wore anything nice, and she wanted to teach me how to present myself as someone worthy of being in their family. Her voice had that practiced tone she used when she was trying to sound reasonable and helpful, instead of controlling and mean. I let her keep talking while I counted to 10 in my head, waiting for her to dig herself deeper into her justifications. She went on about expensive perfumes and refined tastes, and how some people just needed guidance to elevate themselves above their natural station. Robert was looking down at his menu, but I could see his jaw getting tighter with every word his mother said. When Sophia finally paused to take a breath, I started listing every single humiliating thing she'd said to me over the past year. I told Robert about the birthday dinner where she announced in front of everyone that I smelled cheap and needed help learning to be sophisticated. I described how she'd said poor people had physical reactions to expensive things because their bodies weren't calibrated for luxury. I repeated her comment about how I was comfortable with mediocrity and needed training to recognize quality. Robert's face went from red to completely pale as he heard his mother's actual words coming out of my mouth instead of her sanitized version of helpful guidance. Sophia tried to interrupt me twice, but I just kept going, my voice steady and factual like I was reading from a list. I continued by describing how Sophia kept a bottle of Evening Meadow by her front door, specifically to spray me down every time I visited. I told Robert about the inspections where she'd sniff me like a dog, and then douse me in perfume if she couldn't smell it strongly enough. I mentioned the 6 extra bottles she gave me for Christmas with a note about how I obviously needed more supply to make wearing it a daily habit. I brought up her book club comments about me resisting improvement because I was too comfortable being mediocre. Robert looked genuinely shocked as the full pattern of his mother's behavior became clear to him, laid out in chronological order. Sophia's face had gone from pale to splotchy red, and she kept opening her mouth to defend herself, but nothing came out that sounded convincing. Robert turned to his mother and asked if everything I was saying was actually true. His voice sounded different from I'd ever heard it, firmer and more direct without his usual tendency to soften everything. Sophia stumbled through some explanation about wanting me to fit into the family properly and represent them well at social events. She said she was just trying to help me understand what was expected of someone in their social circle. Robert cut her off and said that spraying someone with perfume against their will wasn't helpful. It was controlling and really disrespectful. I stayed completely quiet and just watched Sophia's face as her son contradicted her for what I was pretty sure was the first time in their entire relationship. She looked like someone had slapped her, confused and hurt and angry all mixed together. Sophia switched tactics and claimed I was exaggerating everything to make her look bad in front of Robert. She said I was being overly sensitive and taking her helpful suggestions as personal attacks when they weren't meant that way at all. I pulled out my phone without saying anything and scrolled to the text message thread between Sophia and me. I handed the phone to Robert and watched his face as he read through months of messages where his mother reminded me to wear Evening Meadow before every visit. There were texts criticizing me when she couldn't smell the perfume on me strongly enough. There were messages about how I needed to take her gift more seriously and show proper appreciation for her efforts to improve me. Sophia's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out as Robert kept scrolling through the evidence of her own words. Robert set my phone down on the table between us and told his mother that her behavior had been completely unacceptable. He said he should have said something much sooner instead of pretending everything was fine when it obviously wasn't. Sophia looked absolutely stunned that her passive son was actually confronting her about anything, let alone taking my side against her. She tried to redirect the conversation back to the mystery of why her house smelled like perfume if I hadn't spilled any. I felt this surge of mean satisfaction watching her scramble to regain control of a conversation that had completely gotten away from her. Robert ignored her attempt to change the subject and kept talking about boundaries and respect. I suggested that maybe Sophia's house smelled like Evening Meadow because she was obsessed with the perfume and had bottles of it scattered everywhere. I pointed out that she'd bought herself a whole collection of it and kept multiple bottles around her house for the specific purpose of spraying me. Robert nodded and said his mother had been pushing this one fragrance so aggressively for months that it made sense her whole home would end up smelling like it. Sophia protested that she barely wore the perfume herself and only kept it around for me. Robert pointed out that she'd been spraying me with it multiple times during every single visit for over a year, so obviously her house would absorb that smell into the furniture and curtains. The conversation ended with Robert telling his mother she needed to apologize to me for how she'd treated me and stop trying to control what I wore or how I presented myself. Sophia gave this incredibly stiff apology that sounded like she was choking on the words, barely making eye contact with me as she said she was sorry if I felt hurt by her actions. I accepted her apology with the same cold politeness, saying I appreciated her saying that. As we left the restaurant and walked to our separate cars, I realized this whole confrontation hadn't actually resolved anything cleanly between us. It had just shifted who had power in the relationship and exposed all the dysfunction that had always been there under the surface of forced family politeness. Over the next few weeks, Sophia stopped calling me directly and only communicated through Robert when she needed to tell me something. He'd relay messages about family events or holidays, and I'd respond through him instead of talking to his mother myself. Robert told me she was still dealing with the smell in her house and had hired yet another professional cleaning company to try some new technique involving ozone machines. I felt way less satisfaction about the whole situation than I'd expected when I first started my revenge plan. There was just this hollow sense that I'd won something, but the victory tasted weird and complicated, like eating food that looked good, but had gone slightly bad. Robert started going to therapy 2 weeks after the restaurant confrontation with his mother. He came home from his first session looking tired and told me the therapist wanted to work on his conflict avoidance patterns. I sat on the couch while he explained how he'd been passive for years, letting Sophia treat me badly because confronting her felt too hard. He said the therapist asked why he chose protecting his mother's feelings over protecting his wife, and he didn't have a good answer. I appreciated his honesty but felt frustrated that it took months of perfume warfare and a public confrontation before he finally decided to address the problem. He apologized again, and I accepted it, though part of me stayed angry that I'd had to fight this battle mostly alone while he watched from the sidelines. Robert scheduled weekly therapy appointments and started reading books about boundaries, which felt like progress even if it came way too late. Sophia's book club dissolved 3 weeks after her contaminated charity luncheon. Robert told me his mother received several emails from members citing scheduling conflicts and busy lives as reasons they couldn't continue meeting. He said Sophia knew the real reason was the smell and her ruined reputation as a hostess. The women who'd been her friends for years were now avoiding her completely, declining invitations and making excuses when she called. Sophia had become socially cut off in a way that reminded me of how she'd made me feel small and wrong at every family gathering. Robert said his mother spent most days alone in her hotel room, while her house continued airing out, calling him to complain about the isolation. The revenge had worked exactly as I'd planned, giving Sophia a taste of the exclusion and judgment she'd inflicted on me. But watching it happen through Robert's sad phone calls didn't feel as good as I'd imagined when I was secretly spraying her curtains and furniture. I stopped carrying Evening Meadow bottles in my purse because there wasn't any point anymore. Sophia's house was already destroyed and her social life was in pieces, so continuing the campaign felt unnecessary. I moved the remaining bottles from my purse to my bathroom cabinet where they sat lined up like evidence of what I'd done. Sometimes I'd open the cabinet to get my toothbrush and see them there, and I'd wonder if I'd gone too far with the whole thing. Other times I'd remember Sophia spraying me at that birthday dinner in front of everyone, telling the whole restaurant I needed training to smell elegant, and the anger would come back hot and fresh. The perfume bottles became this weird reminder of both my victory and my guilt, sitting there in my bathroom like a secret I couldn't quite decide how to feel about. I thought about throwing them away but kept them instead, maybe because getting rid of them felt like pretending the whole thing never happened. Robert suggested over dinner one night that we should reduce our visits to Sophia's house from weekly to once a month. I agreed right away, feeling relieved to have official permission to see less of his mother and her contaminated home. He looked sad when I agreed so quickly, probably hoping I'd protest or suggest we should support her through this difficult time. Instead, I told him the distance would be good for everyone and give Sophia space to deal with her situation without us watching. Robert nodded and said he was finally accepting that some relationships get damaged beyond easy repair, and his voice sounded resigned in a way I'd never heard before. We finished dinner in quiet, and I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and sadness about how fractured everything had become between his family and me. Sophia sold her house 6 months after the perfume situation hit its worst point. Robert told me she couldn't stand living with the smell anymore, even after all the professional cleaning and fumigation attempts. The house had become this constant reminder of her ruined social reputation, and the mystery she couldn't solve about how Evening Meadow had invaded every corner of her life. She moved to a smaller condo across town, trading her big suburban house with the fancy furnishings for a simple 2-bedroom unit in a newer building. Robert said she didn't invite us to see the new place for weeks, keeping her distance the same way we were keeping ours. I felt oddly relieved when he told me about the move, like Sophia starting over somewhere new might let all of us move past the perfume disaster without having to keep pretending everything was normal in that contaminated house. We finally visited Sophia's new condo 2 months after she moved in. The space was completely different from her old house, with plain white walls and simple furniture instead of the heavy curtains and ornate decorations she'd always preferred. Everything smelled neutral and clean, like a hotel room that had never been lived in. I walked through looking for perfume bottles but didn't see a single one anywhere, not on her dresser or bathroom counter, or by the front door where she used to keep Evening Meadow for spraying me. Sophia greeted me at the door with a polite hello that had no warmth in it, and I responded the same way, both of us performing basic civility without any real connection underneath. Robert tried to make conversation about her decorating choices, but the atmosphere stayed stiff and uncomfortable. We left after an hour, and I felt relieved to get back in the car, away from the fake politeness and careful distance we were all maintaining. Sophia never directly accused me again of causing the perfume problem in her old house. But sometimes during our monthly visits to her condo, I'd catch her watching me with suspicious eyes, like she was still trying to figure out what really happened. Her gaze would follow me when I moved around her living room, and I could tell she hadn't stopped wondering if I was somehow responsible for months of torture and thousands of dollars in losses. I never confessed and never planned to, letting her live with the uncertainty the same way she'd made me live with constant criticism and control over what I wore and how I smelled. Robert noticed the tension between us but didn't push either of us to talk it out or reconcile beyond basic politeness. He seemed to accept that his mother and wife would never be close, and the best we could manage was civil distance during required family contact. My relationship with Robert got better as he continued therapy and worked on setting boundaries with Sophia. He apologized multiple times for not defending me sooner against his mother's behavior, acknowledging that he'd enabled Sophia by staying passive and avoiding conflict. I forgave him slowly over several months, though I made it clear that if he ever let his mother treat me that way again, I was done with both of them. Robert promised he understood and started proving it by supporting me when Sophia made small critical comments during visits. He'd interrupt her or change the subject instead of letting her remarks sit there poisoning the conversation. The change felt genuine, and I appreciated seeing him finally stand up to his mother, even if it took a perfume disaster to force the growth. Sophia started dating someone she met at her new condo complex about 8 months after moving in. Robert told me his mother seemed lighter and happier, less focused on controlling everyone around her now that she had her own relationship to think about. I felt oddly relieved that Sophia was building a life separate from obsessing over her son and daughter-in-law and our choices. Maybe the perfume disaster and social isolation had forced her to look at her own behavior and make changes, though she'd never admit that out loud. Robert said Sophia's new boyfriend was easygoing and seemed to balance out her controlling tendencies, which sounded promising even though I had no plans to become close with either of them. Robert and I established new family boundaries that included limited contact with Sophia and no more forced attendance at her social events. We told her we'd visit once a month but wouldn't be coming to holiday parties or charity functions anymore. Sophia protested at first, saying families should spend more time together, not less, but eventually she accepted the new arrangement. Maybe she recognized she had no leverage anymore to demand our presence or control our behavior. Our monthly visits stayed brief and focused on safe topics like weather and Robert's work, rather than personal matters that might lead to conflict. The relationship felt hollow compared to what families were supposed to be, but it was honest in a way it never had been before, when we were all pretending Sophia's behavior was acceptable. I pushed my cart through the produce section about 3 weeks after our monthly visit to Sophia's condo, when I spotted a woman from her old book club examining avocados near the organic section. She looked up and recognized me immediately, her face shifting into something between sympathy and relief, as she abandoned her shopping and walked over to intercept me before I could pretend not to notice her. She touched my arm gently and pulled me slightly away from the main traffic flow of shoppers, lowering her voice like she was sharing something she'd been holding onto for months. She told me she was glad I was standing up to Sophia now because the whole book club had found her exhausting and judgmental for years before the perfume incident even happened. Several members had been looking for an excuse to leave the group anyway, she admitted, and Sophia's social isolation after the charity luncheon disaster just gave them the opening they needed to quietly distance themselves without confrontation. The woman said Sophia had a way of making everyone feel inadequate about their choices, from their clothing to their home decor to how they raised their children, and most of the group had tolerated it only because leaving felt more dramatic than staying. Hearing this validation from someone in Sophia's own social circle made something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. I thanked her for telling me, and she squeezed my hand before heading back to her shopping, leaving me standing there processing the fact that I hadn't been alone in experiencing Sophia's criticism and control. The encounter stayed with me for days, this confirmation that Sophia's behavior had pushed away more people than just me, and her current isolation was a consequence she'd been building toward long before I started spraying evening meadow in her house. Robert called me from work 2 months later, asking if I'd be okay with his mother's new boyfriend joining us for Thanksgiving dinner at our place. I agreed partly because I was curious, and partly because I figured Sophia would behave better with an audience who didn't know her history of controlling behavior. The boyfriend arrived with Sophia looking nervous in a way I'd never seen her, clutching a bottle of wine and introducing him with an almost girlish enthusiasm that felt completely foreign coming from the woman who used to inspect me at her door. His name was Tom, and he was easygoing in that casual way that suggested he didn't take life too seriously, making jokes about traffic and complimenting our house without any of the pointed observations Sophia used to make about our furniture choices or decorating style. Sophia sat next to him at the dinner table, and I watched her behave almost normally, asking me polite questions about work, and thanking me for cooking without any comments about proper seasoning techniques or sophisticated presentation. She smiled at Tom frequently like she was checking to make sure he approved of her behavior. And when he touched her hand, she softened in a way that made her seem like a completely different person than the mother-in-law who used to force perfume on me. The performance was transparent because I knew what Sophia was capable of when she wanted to assert dominance, but I appreciated the reduced hostility, even if it was motivated entirely by her desire to impress her new relationship. She didn't make a single critical comment the entire evening, and even complimented the dessert I'd made, though her eyes flickered with something that might have been the urge to suggest improvements before Tom squeezed her shoulder, and she swallowed whatever she'd been about to say. Robert noticed too, and caught my eye across the table with a look that said he was as surprised as I was by his mother's restrained behavior. The evening ended pleasantly with Tom thanking us multiple times, and Sophia giving me an awkward half-hug at the door that felt like her attempt at normal family affection. After they left, Robert stood in the kitchen helping me load the dishwasher, and admitted he barely recognized his mother when she was trying to impress someone new. Robert came home from meeting his mother for lunch about a week later, and found me folding laundry in the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed looking uncomfortable in that way he got when he had to tell me something about Sophia that might upset me. He said his mother had asked him if I would ever forgive her for how she'd treated me over the years, and I stopped folding mid-shirt to look at him and wait for what he'd said in response. Robert told me he'd been honest with her and explained that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting, and our relationship would never go back to how it was before, because too much had happened and too many boundaries had been crossed. I felt relief wash through me that he hadn't made promises on my behalf, or pressured me through him to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't fine, and might never be fine. He said Sophia had gotten quiet after he told her that, and then changed the subject to Tom and their plans to visit his daughter in another state. I asked Robert if he thought his mother actually wanted forgiveness, or if she just wanted things to go back to normal, so she could stop feeling uncomfortable about the distance between us. He considered this for a long moment before admitting he wasn't sure, but he thought maybe the question itself was progress, even if Sophia didn't fully understand what real forgiveness would require. I went back to folding laundry and told him I appreciated that he'd been honest with his mother, instead of trying to smooth things over and make everyone comfortable at my expense. The conversation settled something between us that had been unresolved, this acknowledgement that our relationship with Sophia had fundamentally changed, and we were both okay with that change even if it meant permanent distance. I stood in my bathroom the next Saturday morning staring at the remaining bottles of Evening Meadow perfume lined up on the shelf where I'd kept them as evidence of my revenge. The glass bottles caught the light coming through the window, and I realized I was finally ready to let go of the physical reminder of what I'd done to Sophia's house and life. Keeping them felt like holding on to anger that I didn't want to carry anymore, this weight of vindictive satisfaction that had served its purpose, but now just took up space in my head and my home. I gathered all 6 bottles in my arms and walked through the house to the back door, pushing it open with my hip and heading straight for the large trash bin we kept outside. The bottles clinked together as I lifted the lid and dropped them one by one into the garbage, hearing them land with dull thuds against the plastic bag lining. The act felt symbolic in a way I hadn't expected, like I was closing a chapter that had consumed too much of my emotional energy over the past year. I didn't regret what I'd done because Sophia's humiliation had forced a confrontation and redistribution of power that never would have happened if I'd just accepted her treatment quietly. But I also didn't want to keep celebrating the revenge or holding on to the anger that had motivated it, so I let the trash bin lid fall shut and walked back inside without looking back. The bathroom shelf looked empty where the bottles had been, and I felt lighter somehow, like I'd put down something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. My birthday arrived 3 months later, and I found a card in the mailbox with Sophia's handwriting on the envelope. I opened it standing in the kitchen expecting some passive-aggressive message disguised as well wishes, but instead found a generic birthday greeting and a gift card to a nice Italian restaurant Robert and I had mentioned liking. The gesture felt like Sophia's version of a peace offering, this acknowledgement of boundaries without explicitly apologizing for crossing them so many times before. She hadn't included any perfume or beauty products or anything that suggested she still thought I needed improvement, just the restaurant gift card and a brief note hoping I had a good birthday. I texted her a brief thank you message and left it at that, accepting the olive branch without warmth but without hostility either. Robert saw the card on the counter when he got home and raised his eyebrows in surprise before asking if I thought his mother was actually trying to change. I told him I thought Sophia was trying to maintain some kind of relationship without admitting she'd been wrong, which was probably the best we could expect from someone who'd spent years believing her criticism was helpful guidance. He nodded and we used the gift card the following weekend, enjoying a quiet dinner without discussing his mother or the complicated history that had brought us to this careful distance. Robert brought home travel brochures one evening about 2 weeks later and spread them across the kitchen table with an excitement I hadn't seen from him in months. He said he thought we should plan a vacation just for the 2 of us, something we hadn't done in years because family obligations and Sophia's expectations had always taken priority over our own plans. I sat down and started looking through the options he'd collected, feeling a sense of liberation at the idea of making plans without considering Sophia's schedule or opinions about appropriate vacation destinations. We debated between beach resorts and mountain cabins, flipping through pictures and reading descriptions while Robert made notes about costs and travel times. He suddenly laughed and said we should probably avoid any destinations known for perfume production, and I laughed genuinely for the first time in months about the whole Evening Meadow situation. The joke felt good instead of bitter, this sign that we could acknowledge what had happened without it poisoning everything between us. We eventually settled on a cabin rental in Colorado for the fall, booking it right there at the kitchen table and feeling like we were reclaiming something that had been lost in all the conflict with his mother. Robert reached across the brochures to hold my hand and thanked me for sticking with him through everything. And I squeezed back knowing that this vacation represented more than just a trip, but a statement that we were building our own life, separate from Sophia's control. I realized one morning while making coffee that I'd stopped thinking about Sophia's humiliating comments and the birthday dinner that had started everything. The memories were still there, but they'd faded from sharp wounds that made me angry every time I remembered them, to dull scars that I could acknowledge without feeling that hot rush of shame and rage. I poured my coffee and stood by the window watching neighbors walk their dogs, and thought about how the revenge had accomplished exactly what I needed it to, even if the methods had been extreme and possibly crossed lines I'd never crossed before. The perfume warfare had forced a confrontation that exposed Sophia's behavior and made Robert finally stand up to his mother, instead of staying passive and letting her treat me however she wanted. The power dynamic in our family had shifted permanently, and Sophia no longer had the leverage to criticize me or control our choices. Because she'd lost her social standing and had to rebuild her life in a way that didn't revolve around managing everyone around her. I finished my coffee feeling something close to peace about the whole situation, not proud of what I'd done but not ashamed either, just accepting that sometimes people push you until you push back, and the fallout is messy but necessary. Sophia's relationship with Tom became serious over the following months, and she started spending holidays with his family, instead of expecting us to always accommodate her schedule and preferences. Robert told me his mother had mentioned feeling welcomed by Tom's adult children and grandchildren, finding a place in their established traditions instead of trying to create new ones centered around herself. He seemed relieved to have reduced pressure and obligations around holiday planning, and I felt grateful for the space to build our own traditions without Sophia's input or criticism. We hosted a small Thanksgiving with 3 couples from our friend group, and it felt relaxed in a way family gatherings with Sophia never had. Everyone bringing dishes they actually wanted to make instead of trying to impress anyone or meet some standard of sophistication. We ate early and played board games, and nobody commented on anyone's cooking techniques or suggested improvements to the table settings. Robert kept catching my eye throughout the evening with small smiles that said he was enjoying this version of family celebration, and I realized we'd both been holding tension around holidays for years, without acknowledging how exhausting Sophia's presence had made every gathering. The evening ended with everyone helping clean up and making plans to do it again next year. And after our friends left, Robert and I sat on the couch surrounded by the comfortable mess of a good party, and agreed this was exactly how we wanted holidays to feel going forward. I ran into one of Sophia's former charity luncheon guests at a community fundraiser about a month later, while I was signing up for a volunteer shift. The woman approached me with a warm smile and made a pointed comment about how nice it was that I'd developed my own sense of style, instead of trying to fit someone else's expectations. I realized she was complimenting me for not conforming to Sophia's standards anymore, and the validation from someone in Sophia's own social circle felt surprisingly meaningful. She said she'd always thought I seemed perfectly fine the way I was, and Sophia's constant suggestions for improvement had been unnecessary, and frankly exhausting to witness. We ended up having a pleasant conversation about local volunteer opportunities, and she encouraged me to join the committee organizing the annual arts festival, because they needed people with fresh perspectives. I signed up right there and got her contact information, feeling like I was building connections in the community that had nothing to do with Sophia, or trying to meet her approval. The woman mentioned before leaving that several people from Sophia's old social circle had been relieved when she moved across town because her judgmental attitude had made every event feel like a test nobody could pass. I thanked her for the honesty and walked away feeling validated in a way I hadn't expected, this confirmation that other people had seen Sophia's behavior clearly and found it as difficult as I had. Robert came home with news about a promotion at work that would require occasional travel to regional offices for training and meetings. He sat down next to me on the couch, looking both excited about the opportunity and concerned about something he needed to ask me. He finally said he wanted to make sure I was comfortable with him being away, given everything we'd been through with his mother, and the strain it had put on our relationship. I assured him I was fine and actually looking forward to having the house to myself sometimes, enjoying the quiet and independence without it meaning anything was wrong between us. The fact that he asked showed how much he'd grown in considering my feelings and needs, instead of just assuming I'd be okay with whatever decisions he made. He seemed relieved and started telling me about the promotion details and what the travel schedule would look like over the next year. I listened and asked questions and felt genuinely happy for him, glad that we'd worked through enough of the Sophia situation that his career advancement didn't feel threatening, or like one more thing being decided without my input. We celebrated with takeout from his favorite restaurant, and spent the evening talking about how the extra money might let us do the Colorado vacation twice a year instead of just once. My phone rang 3 weeks later while I was folding laundry, and Sophia's name appeared on the screen for the first time since Robert's promotion celebration. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out, so I pressed accept and heard her voice asking if I had a few minutes to talk about something personal. She sounded different, less commanding and more uncertain, which made me sit down on the couch with the laundry basket forgotten on the floor. Sophia explained that her boyfriend's daughter was getting married next spring, and she wanted advice on how to be a good future mother-in-law without stepping on toes or making anyone uncomfortable. The irony hit me so hard I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. This woman who had spent months criticizing everything about me was now asking for guidance on respecting boundaries. I took a breath and told her honestly that the best thing she could do was let the couple make their own choices about the wedding and their life together, without offering opinions unless specifically asked. Sophia listened quietly, and then asked what else I thought was important, so I added that she should never criticize the bride's choices or try to change things to match her own preferences. I could hear her writing notes on the other end of the line, and I wondered if she understood that every piece of advice I was giving her was something she had violated repeatedly with me. She thanked me genuinely before we hung up, and I sat there staring at my phone thinking about how strange it felt to help the person who had made my life miserable. I started volunteering at the women's shelter downtown the following month after seeing a notice at the community center about their need for intake coordinators. The orientation session covered recognizing signs of controlling behavior in relationships, and I found myself nodding along as the trainer described tactics that sounded uncomfortably familiar from my own experience with Sophia. My first shift involved helping a woman fill out paperwork while her 2 kids colored at a nearby table, and she kept apologizing for taking up my time, even though that was literally why I was there. I assured her she wasn't bothering anyone, and listened as she explained how her husband had controlled everything from what she wore to who she could talk to, making her feel worthless and incompetent. Hearing her story made me realize how relatively minor my situation with Sophia had been compared to what some women survive daily, and I felt grateful that I'd had the resources and support system to fight back against the control. The work was harder than I expected, but also deeply fulfilling, giving me a sense of purpose that came from channeling my anger about Sophia's treatment into something that actually helped other people. I went home after each shift feeling drained but also more grounded, like I was doing something meaningful with the experience instead of just carrying around bitterness. The other volunteers were kind and dedicated, and nobody asked intrusive questions about why I'd chosen this particular cause to support. Robert and I celebrated our anniversary with a quiet dinner at home instead of going out, and I made his favorite pasta while he set the table with candles and the nice dishes we usually saved for company. We ate slowly and talked about the past year, how much had changed in our relationship and with his mother, and he reached across the table to take my hand. He told me he was grateful I'd been patient with him while he learned to stand up to Sophia and set boundaries that should have existed from the beginning of our marriage. I squeezed his fingers and admitted honestly that I wasn't always patient, and I'd done some things during that time that I wasn't entirely proud of, though I didn't specify what those things were. Robert looked at me seriously and said that whatever I'd done to survive his mother's treatment was understandable, given how bad things had gotten before he finally stepped up. His acceptance of my vague confession felt like permission to forgive myself for the perfume campaign, even though he didn't know the specific details of my revenge. We finished dinner and moved to the couch to watch a movie, and I leaned against his shoulder feeling more settled in our relationship than I had in years. Sophia called Robert 2 months later with excitement in her voice that I could hear from across the room, even though the phone wasn't on speaker. He congratulated her warmly and asked questions about the proposal, and they talked for over 40 minutes about her boyfriend's romantic plans and the ring he'd chosen. I listened to Robert's side of the conversation while pretending to read a book, and I noticed how relaxed he sounded talking to his mother, without the underlying tension that used to make every call feel stressful. When he finally hung up, he told me Sophia was engaged and seemed genuinely happy in a way he hadn't seen since before his father died years ago. I told him I was glad for her in an abstract way, hoping this new relationship would give her the emotional fulfillment she'd seemed to be seeking through controlling everyone around her. Robert nodded and said he thought having a partner who challenged her behavior might be good for his mother, and I agreed, while privately doubting Sophia was capable of real change. Still, I felt something shift inside me, a loosening of the anger I'd been carrying since the birthday dinner disaster, and I realized I wanted her to be happy even if we would never be close. We attended Sophia's wedding ceremony at her condo complex on a sunny Saturday afternoon, and I wore a simple blue dress that I'd chosen myself without any input or criticism from anyone. The ceremony was small, with maybe 30 guests seated in rows of white chairs on the lawn, and Sophia looked genuinely happy standing next to her new husband in a cream-colored suit. She saw me arrive and held my gaze for a moment before giving a small nod that felt like acknowledgement, or maybe respect, and I nodded back with similar formality. Something unspoken passed between us in that exchange, an acceptance of where we'd ended up after all the conflict and damage, and I took my seat next to Robert feeling like we'd reached some kind of truce. The ceremony was short and sweet, with personal vows that made several people cry, and Sophia's voice only wavered once when she promised to respect her new husband's independence and trust his judgment. I wondered if she was thinking about how she'd failed to do those things with her son and daughter-in-law, but her face showed only happiness as she kissed her husband and everyone applauded. The reception was held in the community center, and I watched Sophia's new husband redirect her gently when she started to make a critical comment about the wedding coordinator's choice of tablecloth colors. She caught herself mid-sentence and laughed. Actually laughed at her own controlling impulse, and I saw her squeeze his hand like she was grateful for the reminder. Her husband smiled at her with genuine affection and suggested the tablecloths looked fine, and Sophia agreed without arguing or insisting her opinion was more sophisticated. I stood near the dessert table observing this interaction and realized she was actually working on her controlling tendencies with someone who wouldn't enable them the way Robert had for years. The growth seemed genuine even if it had come after causing significant damage to our relationship that probably couldn't be fully repaired. Robert joined me and commented that his mother seemed different with her new husband, calmer and less rigid, and I agreed while eating a piece of wedding cake that was actually pretty good. Robert and I hosted a dinner party with our friends a few weeks later, and I wore jeans and a casual sweater instead of worrying about looking sophisticated or put together. I served the food I wanted to make instead of trying to impress anyone with complicated recipes, and I didn't stress about whether the house was perfectly clean or the table setting was elegant enough. Midway through the evening, while everyone was laughing at someone's story, I realized I'd stopped defining myself in relation to Sophia's criticisms and expectations. I wore what I wanted, served food I liked, decorated my home the way that made me happy, and didn't worry about meeting some arbitrary standard that had never really mattered anyway. The freedom felt hard-won and precious, something I'd fought for through messy and extreme methods that I still wasn't entirely proud of. But sitting there with my friends and my husband, I felt grateful I'd fought back instead of just accepting Sophia's treatment as something I had to endure. Sophia and her new husband announced they were moving to a retirement community in another state to be near his children and grandchildren. Robert got the news over the phone and looked sad when he told me, but also relieved in a way he probably didn't want to admit. The physical distance felt appropriate for where our relationship had ended up, close enough to maintain contact, but far enough to prevent the daily interference that had poisoned things before. I told Robert I supported whatever he was feeling about his mother's move, and he admitted he was conflicted between missing her and feeling glad she'd be living her own life somewhere else. We helped Sophia pack up her condo over a weekend, and she thanked us both for coming, but didn't make any comments about how we were doing it wrong or suggest better methods. The move happened quickly after that, and suddenly Sophia was gone from our daily lives in a way that felt both strange and freeing. 6 months after Sophia's move, we flew out to visit her new home in a sunny retirement community with palm trees and golf carts everywhere. She greeted us at the door of her small villa with genuine enthusiasm and immediately started showing us around the community like she was proud of her new life. We walked past the pool and the clubhouse while she pointed out where she took her morning walks and which neighbors had become friends, and I noticed she didn't perform or pretend to be more sophisticated than everyone else. She introduced us to several neighbors without any of the pretension that used to make every social interaction feel like a competition, and they seemed to actually like her as a person, rather than tolerating her out of obligation. I saw glimpses of who Sophia might have been without the constant need to assert superiority, and prove she was better than everyone around her. Robert seemed pleased to see his mother happy and settled, and I felt something close to compassion for this woman who had caused me so much pain, but was clearly trying to build a better version of herself. On our last evening visiting Sophia, she pulled me aside privately while Robert was helping her husband with something in the garage. We stood on her small patio looking at the sunset, and she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. She said simply that she knew she hadn't been kind to me, and she was sorry for making me feel inadequate and criticizing everything I did. The apology was direct without excuses or justifications, no claims that she'd meant well or was just trying to help, and I could tell it cost her something to admit fault so plainly. I looked at her lined face and saw genuine regret there, and I told her I accepted her apology, and I was glad she was happy now with her new husband and new life. That was true even though I knew our relationship would never be close or easy, that too much damage had been done for us to ever be more than polite relatives who saw each other occasionally. Sophia nodded like she understood and accepted those limitations, and we stood there in silence for a moment before going back inside to join Robert and her husband for dinner. The drive back from Sophia's retirement community stretched long and quiet, broken only by the hum of tires on highway, and Robert's occasional sniffles. I glanced over at him gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, while tears ran down his face in steady streams that he didn't bother wiping away. I reached across the center console and took his free hand in mine, holding it firmly while he processed everything he was feeling about his mother's apology and new life. He kept driving, but his fingers squeezed mine back hard, and I knew he was sorting through complicated emotions about having a parent who had hurt people he loved, but was genuinely trying to become someone better. I didn't tell him about the perfume revenge because that burden was mine alone to carry. But I did tell him I understood complicated family feelings, and he didn't have to choose between loving his mother and acknowledging her flaws. He nodded without speaking, and we drove the rest of the way home in silence that felt comfortable rather than tense. Just two people who'd been through something difficult together, and were figuring out how to move forward. Sophia started sending occasional text messages a few weeks after our visit, usually photos of her morning walks through the retirement community or pictures of flowers blooming in the common areas. I responded politely to each one with brief comments about how nice everything looked or how happy she seemed in the photos. The communication stayed superficial but consistent, maintaining connection without intimacy in a way that worked for both of us. She never pushed for deeper conversation, and I never offered more than surface pleasantries, keeping our relationship at a distance that felt safe after everything that had happened. Robert noticed me responding to his mother's texts and thanked me one evening for being willing to stay in contact with her despite our history. I told him honestly that I appreciated he never pressured me to pretend our relationship was more than it actually was, that he seemed to understand the difference between polite contact and genuine closeness. He kissed my forehead and said he was grateful we'd all found a way to coexist, even if it wasn't the happy family dynamic he'd once imagined. 6 months later, I got promoted to a senior position at my job, managing a whole team instead of just being a regular employee. I called Robert from the office to tell him the news, and he took me out to dinner that night to celebrate. 3 days after my promotion, a congratulations card arrived in the mail with Sophia's return address on the envelope. I opened it carefully and read her handwritten message saying she always knew I was capable, even if she didn't express it well when we were spending more time together. The acknowledgement felt like another piece of closure, her admitting in her own indirect way that her criticism had never really been about my actual abilities or worth. I filed the card away in my desk drawer as evidence that people could grow and change even after causing significant harm to others. The gesture didn't erase the years of humiliation or make us suddenly close, but it showed she was capable of recognizing she'd been wrong about me. Robert and I started trying for a baby that fall, timing everything carefully and hoping each month would bring positive results. I realized during one of our conversations about potential baby names that I wasn't worried anymore about Sophia being an overbearing grandmother who would criticize our parenting choices. The physical distance between our home and her retirement community created natural boundaries that would prevent daily interference. Her relationship with her new husband's grandchildren showed she was capable of being supportive without being controlling, sending them birthday cards and video calling occasionally without inserting herself into their parents' decisions. I felt cautiously optimistic about the future in a way I couldn't have imagined during the months of perfume warfare, when Sophia's house reeked of evening meadow, and our relationship consisted entirely of passive-aggressive attacks. Sophia's new husband had a health scare the following spring that put him in the hospital for a week with heart problems. She called Robert genuinely frightened and vulnerable, her voice shaking as she described the tests and procedures and uncertainty about his recovery. Robert told her he'd fly out the next day to support her, and I encouraged him to go without guilt or hesitation. I packed his bag while he booked the flight and drove him to the airport early the next morning. He stayed with Sophia for 5 days while her husband recovered, and when Robert returned home, he told me his mother had thanked him multiple times for raising such an understanding wife. The compliment felt like recognition of how far we'd all come from the birthday dinner disaster when Sophia had sprayed me with disgusting perfume in front of everyone at the restaurant. I didn't need her gratitude, but I accepted it as evidence that she saw me differently now, as someone who could be kind even to people who had hurt me. I found out I was pregnant 2 months later when a home test showed 2 clear pink lines. Robert and I set up a video call with Sophia that evening to tell her the news together. She appeared on the screen sitting in her sunny living room, and we told her she was going to be a grandmother. Sophia's eyes filled with tears immediately, and she pressed her hands to her mouth before pulling them away to speak. She promised through her crying that she would be a helpful grandmother who respected our parenting choices, that she'd learned from her mistakes and wanted to do better with our child. I chose to believe her because people could change, and she'd shown real evidence of growth over the past year. Robert squeezed my hand during the call, and I knew we were both thinking about how different this moment might have been if we hadn't forced the confrontation about her behavior, if we'd just continued pretending everything was fine while resentment built up between us. Sophia flew back for a visit during my second trimester when I was 5 months along and visibly pregnant. She arrived at our house carrying shopping bags full of baby items, and I braced myself for criticism about our nursery choices, or lectures about proper child rearing. Instead, she pulled out thoughtful gifts that reflected our actual tastes rather than her preferences, including a soft blanket in colors we'd mentioned liking, and books we'd talked about reading to the baby. She asked permission before giving any advice about pregnancy or baby care, and backed off immediately when I set boundaries about topics I didn't want to discuss. The visit lasted 3 days and stayed pleasant throughout, with Sophia respecting our space and schedule without trying to take over or control everything. I realized as I watched her pack to leave that the perfume revenge, while extreme and probably excessive, had created the crisis that forced everyone to address the dysfunction in our family and rebuild relationships on healthier terms. Robert and I decided to name our daughter Cindy Sophia, giving her both a name we loved and a connection to Robert's mother. We told Sophia over video call a week before the baby was born, and she cried when she heard her name was included as a middle name. Robert explained to his mother that despite the difficult history between us, she was important to him, and he wanted his child to carry that connection forward. I supported the decision fully because the name represented not just Sophia herself, but the whole complicated journey of learning to set boundaries and demand respect in family relationships. Sophia thanked us both with genuine emotion in her voice, saying she didn't deserve the honor, but would try to live up to it by being the grandmother Cindy deserved. Sophia held our newborn daughter for the first time in the hospital 2 days after Cindy was born. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled the tiny baby in her arms, and she whispered that she would try to be the grandmother this child deserved, someone supportive and loving without being controlling or critical. I watched her gentle touch and soft voice, and felt genuinely hopeful that she meant what she was saying. Robert stood beside me with his arm around my waist, both of us exhausted from labor and delivery, but peaceful in this moment. We were both thinking about how this scene of Sophia holding our daughter with such tenderness had grown from the ashes of perfume-soaked curtains and forced confrontations, how sometimes relationships had to be completely destroyed before they could be rebuilt into something honest and real. Cindy turned 6 months old in early winter, and Sophia flew back for another visit to see how much the baby had grown. She arrived at our door carrying her usual bags, but this time pulled out a gift for me, separate from all the baby items. A beautiful scarf in deep blue that she said reminded her of my actual style, rather than what she used to think I should wear. I accepted it with genuine appreciation, and we sat down together for coffee while Cindy napped in her crib upstairs. We talked like two women who'd been through battle together, and came out respecting each other's strength, discussing Sophia's life in the retirement community, and my experiences as a new mother. The relationship would never be simple or easy. Too much damage had been done for us to ever be truly close the way some mothers and daughters were. But it was real now in a way it never was before. Built on honest confrontation rather than polite pretense where everyone smiled while hiding resentment. I found myself surprised that this complicated, difficult, authentic connection was enough for both of us.